Good evening, night creatures. Not to be confused with Nyx, but tonight we learn about the next primordial deity of darkness and shadow, Erebus. Prologue. What fills the space between things? There is a question that physics has been asking for a century, and that mythology asked 3,000 years before physics existed. What is between things? Not what is in things. Not the substance of the matter, the composition of the stuff, the elements and their arrangements. What is between things? The space that separates one thing from another. The gap between the atom and its neighbor. The void between the star and the next star. The darkness between the words on this page. The intuitive answer is nothing. Between the things is the absence of the things. The between is the negation of the thing, the place where the thing is not, the empty space that we call a vacuum, a void, the nothing that surrounds the something. But this intuitive answer is wrong. Physics has demonstrated it with considerable rigor and some surprise. The space between things is not empty. It is occupied by fields. By the electromagnetic field, the gravitational field, the quantum fields that fill every point of space, with a seething activity of virtual particles and energies. The vacuum is not empty. The vacuum is the most fundamental state of the fields, and the fields are as real as anything is real. The between is full. More dramatically, the between is the majority. The visible matter of the universe, every star, every galaxy, every atom of every element, everything that light touches, and therefore everything that can in principle be seen, constitutes perhaps 5% of the universe's actual content. The remainder is dark. Dark matter, dark energy, the constituents of the cosmos that do not interact with light, that are not illuminated, that are present and real and constitutive of the universe's structure without being visible. The universe is mostly dark, mostly between, mostly the substance that is not the visible matter, but the medium within which the visible matter moves and structures itself. Erebus is this. Not as a metaphor for these physical facts. The mythology predated the physics by 3 millennia and was not making claims about quantum field theory, but as the mythological expression of the same intuition that the physics would eventually confirm. The between is not empty. The darkness is not the absence of the thing. The dark that fills the space between things is a real constituent of the world, as fundamental as the things themselves, as necessary to the world's structure as the matter that composes the things. He was the primordial dark, not the darkness of the night. That was Nyx, his sister and his wife, the darkness of the time when the sun was absent. He was the darkness of the between, the darkness that occupied the space between things, the dark that was there regardless of what time it was, the dark that was the medium within which everything else existed. He was the condition of everything being where it was. The things had their places because the between spaces that separated them were filled with the dark that was his substance, the real constituent that made the space between things real rather than empty. Without him, no between. Without the between, no separation. Without the separation, no specific things. only the undifferentiated merging of everything into everything. He made the world possible by being what filled the space between the things that were the world. He was Erebus. He was the dark between. And this is his story, told not as a simple narrative of events, because the primordial dark does not primarily have events, told as the exploration of what it means to be the between, what it means to be the condition rather than the thing conditioned, what it means to be the darkness that is not nothing, and is not the visible, and is not the organized, but is the necessary medium of all of these. The nature of the primordial dark. Part 1. The cosmological position. Chapter 1. The order of emergence. Hesiod wrote Theogony, the account of the birth of the gods, sometime in the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, drawing on traditions that was already old when he set them down, traditions that reached back to the oral poetry of the Greek Dark Ages, and beyond that, into the mythological inheritance of the broader Indo-European world. He began with chaos. Verily, first of all, did chaos come into being. The first word is not God, not the divine intelligence that creates from outside, not the light or the good or the one. The first word is chaos, the gap, the void, the undifferentiated condition that was before specific conditions, the abyss that was before the things. Then Gaia, the earth, the ground, the first great specificity, the surface on which everything would eventually stand. Then Tartarus, the depth, the abyss, the absolute below, the bottom that the world rested above. Then Eros, the force of attraction, the movement toward, the principle that would make the cosmos generative. And among the very first, Erebus and Nyx, the darkness and the night, the spatial dark and the temporal dark, the dark that was where and the dark that was when. The sequence was not arbitrary. It was the Greek tradition's compressed cosmological account, the order of emergence of the first specific realities from the undifferentiated prior condition. And what the sequence said was that the dark was among the very first things, before the gods, before the titans, before the organized divine world, with its hierarchy and its conflicts and its stories. The dark was first. Not first in the absolute sense. Chaos was first, the undifferentiated prior to all differentiation. But among the first differentiations, the first specific realities, the darkness was there. Erebus was there. The between dark was there, when the world was first becoming the world. This primordial position was not incidental. It was the tradition's claim about the nature of darkness, not a secondary reality, not a derivative condition, not the result of the light being absent. A primary reality, a foundational condition, a constituent of the world from the very beginning. He was among the first. He was there. He was the between dark that was one of the first specific things in the world. Chapter 2. The distinction between chaos and Erebus. The distinction between chaos and Erebus was the distinction between the undifferentiated and the specific dark, between the prior condition and the first dark. Chaos was the gap, the void, the state in which no specific properties applied. Not dark, not light, not any specific quality, because no specific quality had yet differentiated from the prior condition. Chaos was not dark in the way that Erebus was dark. Chaos was the condition before the distinction between dark and light had become operative, the state in which neither term applied, because neither had yet become specific. Then Erebus, the first differentiation in the direction of the dark, the first moment in which the world had darkness as a specific quality, rather than the prior undifferentiated condition which was before darkness and light both. This made Erebus the first specific dark, not a darkness that was the opposite of light. Light had not yet been produced, not at the moment of Erebus's emergence. A darkness that was the first positive quality, the first this rather than that, in the direction of the obscure. The distinction mattered philosophically. Chaos as nothing, as the pure void, the absolute negation, was one philosophical position, and it was the position that the later tradition sometimes attributed to the Greek cosmological account. But chaos as the undifferentiated prior condition, as the something that was not yet specific, rather than the nothing that was the pure negation, was a different and more sophisticated position. And Erebus as the first specific dark, as the positive presence of the dark, rather than the mere absence of the light, was the position that followed from the more sophisticated understanding. He was the positive dark, the first specific quality, the first this rather than that. He was not nothing. He was the something that came before the light, the dark that was the first specific thing to emerge in the direction of the obscure, the substantial darkness that would be the condition of the world's organized structure. Chapter 3: Substance of the Dark. What was the substance of Erebus? What was the dark between made of? This was not a question that Hesiod addressed directly. The Theogony was not a treatise in natural philosophy, was not asking about the material constitution of the Primordials. But the question had implicit answers in the way the tradition deployed the figure of Erebus, in the ways the primordial dark appeared in the mythology. The dark was the between. The substance of the between was the substance of the condition, not the matter of the things, but the medium of the thing's existence. Not what the things were made of, but what they were in. This was the peculiar ontological status of the between. It was not the thing, but the condition of the thing. Not the matter, but the medium. Not the organized, but the condition of the organization. The philosophers who followed the mythological tradition found this peculiar ontological status philosophically interesting. Anaximander's Apeiron, the unlimited, the indefinite, the boundless, that was the principle from which all things came, and to which all things returned, had the quality of the dark between. It was not any specific thing. It was the condition of the specific things. It was the medium within which the specific things existed. The Apeiron was not darkness in the visual sense, was not primarily about the absence of light, but it shared with the darkness of Erebus the quality of being the medium rather than the matter, the condition rather than the thing. The dark between was the condition. The substance of the condition was the substance of the between, the real constituent of the world that was not the organized matter of the specific things, but the medium within which they existed. This medium was real, It was not the emptiness that the naive understanding would make it. It was the between, the dark between, the substance of the condition, real in the way that the condition of the things was as real as the things themselves, as necessary as the conditions were necessary. He was this real condition. The substance of the between was his substance. He was made of the dark that was the medium of the world. Chapter 4. The Spatial and the Temporal. He was paired with Nyx, and the pairing expressed a fundamental cosmological distinction, the distinction between the spatial and the temporal dimensions of the dark. Night was the temporal dark, the darkness of the time when the sun was absent, the darkness that alternated with the day in the rhythm that defined the world's most fundamental temporal cycle. Night came and went. Night was the dark of the when, the darkness that was when the sun was below the horizon, when the earth's surface was turned away from the light. Erebus was the spatial dark, the darkness of the place, the dark that occupied the between spaces of the cosmos, the dark that was always there in the deep places regardless of what time it was. He was the dark of the where, the darkness that was where the light did not penetrate, where the between spaces were, where the deep places were. The distinction was real and important. Night's darkness was cyclical. It came and went, was the darkness of the turning cycle, was the darkness that was reliably followed by the day. Erebus's darkness was permanent. It was the dark of the deep caves that were dark regardless of whether it was night or day above them, the dark of the ocean's depths that received no sunlight, regardless of the hour, the dark of the spaces between the stars that was dark, regardless of the positions of the celestial bodies. Together they constituted the fullness of the dark, the temporal cycle of the night, and the permanent spatial dark of the between. Neither alone was sufficient for the full account of darkness. The night without the between dark was the darkness of the cycle, without the darkness of the permanent. The between dark without the night was the permanent dark, without the rhythmic dark. Together, they were the complete account. He was the permanent spatial dark. She was the rhythmic temporal dark. Together, they were the fullness of what darkness was in the world, the where and the when of the dark, the permanent and the cyclical, the spatial and the temporal. And together, in their union, which was both the siblinghood of the shared origin and the marriage of the complementary natures, they produced the light, ether and hemera, brightness and day. The fullness of the dark was the parent of the fullness of the light. Chapter 5. The production of light. The dark produced the light. This was the mythology's most extraordinary claim about Erebus and Nyx, and it was a claim that deserves extended attention because it inverted the intuitive expectation that the light was primary and the dark was its absence. Ether was their firstborn, the bright upper air, the divine atmosphere, the medium in which the celestial fires moved. Ether was the luminous, was light and brightness personified, was the quality of the divine realm that made it the realm of the bright rather than the realm of the dark. And ether was the child of Erebus and Nyx. The brightness came from the dark. The luminous came from the obscure. The first light was the production of the first dark. This was not paradox in the sense of contradiction. It was paradox in the sense of the apparent contradiction that, when fully understood, revealed a deeper truth. The deeper truth was the cosmological claim about the relationship between the dark and the light. The light was not the primary condition. The light was not the original. The light was not the given from which the dark was the deviation. The dark was the original. The light was the production. The darkness was first. The light was produced from the darkness. The physics, as noted, confirmed this in its own vocabulary. The early universe was dark, was the dense, hot plasma of the first moments, and then the cool dark of the period before the first stars. The first light came later, when the first stars ignited in the darkness, when the nuclear fires burned in the primordial dark and produced the first illumination. The dark was first. The light came from the dark. He was the father of the light in this precise cosmological sense. The primordial dark was the condition from which the first light emerged, the medium within which the first fires could burn. Ether, the brightness, came from Erebus and Nyx, because the brightness came from the prior dark. He was not only the darkness, he was the dark that generated the light, the condition from which the organized, illuminated world eventually came. Part 2. The character of the between. Chapter 6. What it meant to be the between. To be the between was to be the condition rather than the thing, to be the medium rather than the matter, the context rather than the content, the space rather than the object. This was a peculiar kind of being. The between was not visible in the ordinary sense. The things that the between separated were visible, could be picked up, handled, observed, described. But the between itself, the space between the things, was not visible in the same way. It was the condition of the thing's visibility, not itself a visible thing. He was this, the condition of the visible, not itself primarily the visible. The dark between was what made the visible things visible by providing the dark contrast against which they were distinguishable. But the dark between itself was not seen as the visible things were seen. This was the paradox of the between's being. It was as real as the things it separated, as fundamental as the things it conditioned, as necessary to the world's structure as the things that were organized within it. And yet it was not visible, not the object of ordinary observation, not the thing that was seen when things were seen. To be the between was to be the necessary invisible, the condition that was as real as the things it conditioned, and that was necessarily not the center of attention in the way the things it conditioned were. Erebus was the necessary invisible. The dark between was real and was not seen. The between was fundamental and was not the object. The condition was necessary and was not the content. This gave him a specific quality in relation to the mythology's other figures. He was always the background, never the foreground. The Olympians were the content, were the beings whose actions and decisions and relationships constituted the mythology's drama. He was the context within which the drama occurred, the dark background against which the divine figures were visible. He was always background. This was not the background as the merely incidental, the merely present but unimportant. It was the background as the necessary condition, the dark that was the condition of the figure's visibility, the between, That was the condition of the dramas occurring. Chapter 7. The Between and Identity. The between was the condition of identity. This was the philosophical claim that the mythology expressed cosmologically. The claim that the separation between things was the condition of the things being the specific things they were. Identity required distinction. The thing was this specific thing, this rock rather than that rock, this person rather than that person, this god rather than that god, because it was distinct from the other things. And the distinction was possible because the between was real, because the space that separated the things was filled with the dark between, the medium that held the things apart and made them be where they were rather than everywhere at once. Without the between, no identity. Without the separation, no distinction. Without the distinction, no specific thing. Only the undifferentiated that was before the things. He was the condition of identity. Every specific thing that existed as a specific thing owed its specificity to the between dark that separated it from the other specific things. Every individual, mortal or divine, owed its individuality to the between that made it this individual rather than a merged part of everything. The gods were distinct from each other because the between was real. Zeus was Zeus rather than Hera or Apollo or Poseidon, because the between that separated them was the real condition of their distinctness. Their identities as the specific divine beings they were required the medium that held them apart. The dark between that was his substance. He was the condition of the gods' identities. The primordial between dark that was the condition of the world's structure was the condition of every specific thing's being the specific thing it was, including every specific divine being's being the specific divine being it was. This gave him a peculiar relationship to the divine world. He was the condition of the divine world's structure, the medium within which the divine world existed, the dark between that made the divine beings distinct from each other. He was not a participant in the divine drama. He was the condition of the drama's being possible. Chapter 8. The Between and Form. The between was the condition of form. This was the insight that the artistic and philosophical traditions would develop from the same cosmological intuition that the mythology expressed through Erebus. The form required the background. The figure required the ground. The visible shape required the dark, against which it was distinguishable. The sculptor who worked in marble understood this practically. The form that was in the stone was the form that was distinguishable from the surrounding stone, that was carved into relief against the background of the unworked stone. The figure emerged from the ground by being distinguished from the ground. The painter understood it. The figure on the canvas was the figure that was distinguishable from the background. That was in contrast with the ground, that had edges where it met the background. That was this color and shape, rather than the background's color and shape. The form required the background. The figure required the ground. The specific shape required the contrast that made the shape specific. He was the primordial ground, the dark background against which the forms of the organized world were distinguishable. Without the between dark, the forms would have no ground to be figure against, would be invisible, would be undifferentiated from everything else. Every form in the world owed its visibility as a form to the dark background that was his. Every shape that was distinguishable because the dark that was his substance was the ground against which the shape was figure. He was the condition of every visible form. The primordial dark was the primordial ground, the condition of the organized world's forms being the forms they were. This was a more fundamental contribution to the world than the mythology usually acknowledged. The Olympians produced specific forms, specific interventions, specific transformations, specific acts that changed specific things. He produced the condition of form itself, the ground that made every form possible by being the dark background against which every form was visible. Chapter 9. The Inhabited Dark. The dark was not uninhabited. This was one of the most important facts about Erebus that the mythology expressed. The between dark was not the empty void of the naive understanding, was not the pure negation, was not the mere absence of the organized. The between dark was inhabited. Not inhabited in the way that Olympus was inhabited, not with the organized divine community, the court, the hierarchy of the gods with their specific domains and their specific relationships. The between dark was inhabited by what the between dark was the appropriate habitat for. The figures of the threshold, the beings of the crossing, the ones who moved between the states. Charon was the most obvious, the ferryman who moved across the dark water, whose entire existence was the movement between the shores. He was the being of the between, the one whose function was the crossing, who inhabited the transitional zone between the living and the dead. The Fates, the Moirai, were associated with the dark. Nyx's daughters, products of the primordial dark, they operated in the between of the before and after of every mortal life. In the between of the not yet born and the born and the dead. The Erinyes, the Furies, operated in the between of the committed deed and the consequence. They inhabited the space between the transgression and its reckoning, the transitional zone where the account was being settled. The dead who waited for the crossing inhabited the between, the newly dead in the first zone, waiting in the transitional state. The between was inhabited by the figures of transition, the beings of the between state, the ones whose function was the crossing. He was the habitat of the transitional, the dark medium that was the appropriate environment for the beings whose nature was the between. Chapter 10. The Permanence of the Deep Dark. He was permanent in a way that the other divine beings were not permanent. The Olympians had their history, had come after the Titans, had come to power through conflict, governed the organized world in the current arrangement that was the result of the divine succession. The Titans had preceded them. The Primordials had preceded the Titans. But the Primordials, and he most particularly, had a different kind of permanence. Not the permanence of the regime that had been established and maintained. The permanence of the condition that was always there, because the condition was the condition of everything. Because the condition was not the result of a succession, but the prior from which every succession derived. The between dark was always there. In the deep caves that went far enough into the earth, caves that were dark on the day of their formation and would be dark on the last day of the earth. He was there. In the space between the stars, space that was dark before the first stars formed and would be dark after the last star burned out. He was there. He was the permanent dark of the deep places, not permanent in the sense of the established regime that had lasted long and would last long, permanent in the sense of the condition that was always the condition, because the condition was the nature of the place. The deep places were always dark, because the light did not reach them. Not because the light was blocked by any specific thing, not because of any specific arrangement that could be changed, because the light that came from the sun or the stars was a local phenomenon, was the illumination of the surface, of the nearby, of the region close enough to the sources of light to be illuminated by them. The deep places were beyond the reach of the local illumination. The deep places were dark because the dark was the condition of the deep, the nature of the between space at sufficient depth and distance from the sources of light. He was the permanent dark of sufficient depth and distance, the dark that was always there in the places where the light did not reach. The underworld region. Part 3. The geography of the first dark. Chapter 11. Between the living and the dead. The underworld had regions. The Greek tradition developed over the centuries an increasingly specific geography of the world below the surface. A geography that differentiated the underworld into zones, each with its own character and its own population, and its own relationship to the lives that the mortal dead had lived. But before the differentiated geography, before Elysium and the Asphodel Meadows and Tartarus and the Court of Judgment and all the specific regions of the organized underworld, there was the first dark. Erebus was the first zone, the undifferentiated dark of the arrival, the darkness that the newly dead entered before they had been processed by the underworld's organization, before the judgment had assigned them to their appropriate region, before they were fully the dead in the organized sense, rather than the transitional sense. He was the threshold, the first zone, the arrival. The geography of the dead began with him. Whatever came after, whatever the judgment assigned, whatever region the shade was sent to, came after the crossing of his zone, the crossing of the dark water, the ferry of Charon, the first encounter with the world of the dead. This was in his zone, in the first dark, in the between of the living and the fully dead. This made him, in the underworld's geography, the border, the boundary zone, the edge, the liminal space between the living world and the organized kingdom of the dead. Not the kingdom itself, not Hades' domain, not the organized structure that Hades administered. The threshold of the kingdom, the first dark that was the condition of the entry. The border was his. The threshold was his. The first dark was his. Chapter 12. The nature of the threshold zone. The threshold zone had specific qualities that distinguished it from both the living world above it and the further underworld below it. It was dark. Obviously, necessarily dark. This was his zone, and his zone was the between dark. But the darkness of the threshold had a specific quality that distinguished it from the ordinary darkness of the night or the cave. It was the darkness of the between state, the darkness appropriate to the condition of the transitional, the darkness that was neither the light of the living world nor the organized underworld's specific dimness. It was uncertain. The threshold zone was the zone of the not yet determined, the zone in which the shade was still in transition, still crossing from what it had been to what it would be, not yet assigned, not yet processed, not yet the fully dead in the organized sense. The uncertainty was the quality of the between state. In the living world, the person was determined. Was this person with this identity and this life? In the organized underworld, the shade was determined, was assigned to the appropriate region, was the dead person processed by the judgment. In the threshold zone, the shade was undetermined, was in the between of the two determinations, was neither the living person it had been, nor the dead shade it would be assigned as. He was the condition of the undetermined. The dark between, that was the condition of the between state. The threshold zone was his zone, because the threshold zone was the undetermined, and the undetermined was the between state. And the between state was his domain. It was populated by the waiting, the shades who waited for the crossing, who lacked the coin, who had not been buried, who were for some reason unable to cross immediately, populated the threshold zone. They were the waiting, the in-between, the not yet crossed. He held them, not imprisoned them, held them in the sense of being the medium in which they existed during the waiting. The dark between was the space of the waiting, the medium of the prolonged between state. Chapter 13. The River Styx. The Styx was the boundary river, the river of hatred, or the river of the oath, the river whose waters the gods invoked when they made their most binding promises. The Styx was the primary river of the threshold zone, the river that most explicitly expressed the quality of the boundary. The Styx encircled the underworld. In the fullest mythological account, it wound around the kingdom of the dead 9 times. The boundary river was not a single line, but a winding enclosure, a multiple boundary, a threshold that was emphasized by its 9-fold repetition. Why 9? The number was the mythological number of the almost infinite, not uncountable, but very many. 9 times was the count that expressed the comprehensive boundary, the boundary that was so thoroughly a boundary that no one could slip through the gaps. The Styx encircled 9 times, so that the boundary was real, was comprehensive, was the actual border between the living and the dead. The Styx was in his zone. The boundary river was in the threshold zone, in the first dark, in the between of the living and the organized dead. The Styx flowed through the darkness between the worlds. The oath sworn by the Styx was the most binding of all oaths, because the Styx was the boundary between the ultimate states, was the river of the border between the living and the dead, between the world and its opposite. To swear by the Styx was to invoke the most fundamental of all boundaries as witness. The oath was binding because the boundary was real, because the dark between the living and the dead was real, because the Styx that flowed through that dark was real. He was the condition of the binding oath. The dark between, his zone, was the condition of the Styx, and the Styx was the condition of the most binding oath. The primordial dark was the condition of the world's most fundamental promise. Chapter 14. Charon's function. Charon ferried the dead. This was his function, his ancient function, his function that predated any specific mythology, and that was simply what the figure of the ferryman at the boundary of death expressed in the Greek tradition and in many others. The ferryman at the boundary was a universal figure, appeared in traditions from many different cultures, in many different forms, always expressing the same essential thing. The crossing from the living to the dead required a mediator, required someone who inhabited the boundary, who was of the boundary, who could cross where the ordinary living and the ordinary dead could not simply cross. Charon was this mediator. His existence was the existence of the between. He was the between made personal, the boundary given a figure, the dark crossing given an agent. He lived in the between zone. He navigated the dark waters. He moved back and forth between the shore of the living world and the shore of the organized dead, carrying the newly dead across. His ancient face, his grim efficiency, his single price. These were the qualities of the being who had been doing this since the beginning, who had navigated the boundary so many times that the crossing had become the most ordinary thing, who had the quality of the long practiced in the minimal movements of his work. He was Erebus's most explicit inhabitant, not because Erebus had created him or appointed him or governed him. The mythology did not give Erebus that kind of active administrative function, but because Charon's nature, the nature of the one who crossed the between, who inhabited the boundary, who made the transition possible, was the nature appropriate to Erebus's domain. He was of the between. He lived in the dark between. He crossed the dark water. He was the being whose entire existence was the crossing, whose nature was the transition, whose function was the between. Charon was what Erebus looked like when the between was given a face and a pole and a ferry. Chapter 15. The Coin and the Burial. The mythology required specific conditions for the crossing. The dead needed to have been buried, needed to have received the funeral rites, the proper treatment of the body that sent the soul properly equipped for the underworld. The dead needed the coin, the obol placed in the mouth or on the eyes of the dead, the payment for Charon's ferry. Without the burial, the shade could not cross for 100 years. Without the coin, the shade could not pay the ferryman. Both requirements expressed something about the threshold, about the conditions of the crossing, about what the transition from the living to the dead required. The burial requirement was the requirement that the living acknowledge the dead, that the community of the living performed its proper function in relation to the newly dead, that the transition from living to dead was marked and honored by those left behind. The crossing required the community's participation. The shade could not cross alone without the community's acknowledgement. The coin requirement was the requirement that the shade arrive equipped, that the crossing was a transaction, that the transition had its cost, that the between was not passed through without something being given. Both requirements express the quality of the threshold. The crossing was serious. The transition was not free. The between was not simply passed through without cost, and without community. He was the condition of the serious crossing. The threshold zone, his zone, was the zone in which the crossing's seriousness was expressed. The 100-year wait for the unburied, the payment for the coin. The primordial dark was the serious dark, the dark that expressed the seriousness of the transition by requiring what the transition required. Chapter 16. The Rivers of the Underworld. Multiple rivers flowed through his zone. The mythology populated the threshold, dark with rivers. With the flowing of the dark water, the movement of the transitional that expressed the quality of the between in liquid form. The Styx was the most important. The Boundary River, the Oath River, the 9 times encircling. But there were others. The Acheron was the river of woe, the bitter river whose waters carried the accumulated grief of every mortal life that had ended, the grief that was appropriate to the transition from living to dead. The Acheron was the river that some traditions made the primary crossing, the river that Charon navigated with his pole, the dark water of the transition. The Lethe was the river of forgetting, not in the threshold zone in all traditions. Some placed it deeper in the underworld, in the regions where the dead awaited reincarnation, but associated with the transitional, with the crossing from one form of existence to another, the forgetting that was the condition of the new beginning. The Lethe's waters erased the previous existence, so the new existence could begin fresh. The Phlegethon was the river of fire, the burning river, the fire that moved through the underworld's dark, not the warming fire but the processing fire, the fire that was the agent of the transition. The Cocytus was the river of lamentation, the sound of the souls who were being processed, the wailing that expressed the grief of the crossing. Each river expressed a quality of the transition, the grief of the ending, the forgetting that was the condition of the new beginning, the fire of the processing, the wailing of the crossing. He held all of these rivers in his zone. They flowed through the dark between, through his substance, through the medium of the threshold zone. The rivers of transition flowed through the dark of the transition. The relationship with Nyx. Part 4. The Union of the Dark. Chapter 17. Brother and Wife. The mythology made Nyx simultaneously his sister and his wife, both children of chaos, both among the first specific realities to emerge from the undifferentiated prior condition. And then, in the union that produced the light, both the parents of the brightness that would be the condition of the organized world. The sibling marriage of the Primordials was not the incest of the human world. The human prohibition on incest was the prohibition that protected the social structure, that prevented the confusion of roles that incest produced in the organized community, that maintained the distinctions between the relations that the social world required. But the Primordials existed before the social world, before the community, before the organized structure that required these distinctions. The sibling marriage of the Primordials was the union of the complementary aspects of the same primordial reality. The union of the where and the when of the dark, the spatial and the temporal, the permanent and the cyclical. They were not simply two separate beings who happened to be siblings and who chose to marry. They were two aspects of the same primordial reality, the darkness in its two fundamental dimensions, and their union was the union of those dimensions, the coming together of the spatial and temporal dark into the fullness of the dark. This fullness, the complete dark, the dark in both its spatial and temporal dimensions, was the condition of the light's production. Together they produced ether and hemera. The spatial dark and the temporal dark together produced the spatial light, ether, the bright upper air, and the temporal light, hemera, the day. The union produced the opposites. The dark in its fullness produced the light in its fullness. The complementary union of the dark's two aspects produced the complementary pair of the light's two aspects. Chapter 18. The Palace at the World's Edge. The mythology gave them a shared palace. A palace at the edge of the world, at the western horizon, at the boundary between the organized world and what was beyond the boundary. The palace that both night and the deep darkness inhabited when they were not in the world. The palace was shared, but never fully simultaneously occupied. The mythology's specific image was of Hemera and Nyx passing each other at the great threshold of bronze. Nyx arriving as Hemera departed, Hemera arriving as Nyx departed. They were never both in the palace at the same time. They were never both in the world at the same time. They alternated. The palace was at the edge of the world, at the western horizon, beyond the ordinary regions of the organized cosmos. The edge was the appropriate location for the Primordials, whose domain was the between, the border zone, the threshold, the edge. But the palace was also more than the edge. The palace was the origin, the place where the dark went when it was not in the world, the place where the temporal dark withdrew when the day came. The palace was the source of the night, the place from which Nyx departed when she went to fill the world with darkness. He was more permanently in the palace than Nyx was. She had her cycle. She came and went, filled the world with night and then withdrew. He was the permanent dark, and the palace was one expression of his permanence. The place that was always dark, always his, always the between at the edge. But the palace was also the between in its physical expression, the edge of the world that was the between of the organized world and what was beyond it. The between that was his substance was there in the palace. The transitional space at the edge that was neither the organized world nor its absolute negation, but the threshold between them. Chapter 19. The Generation of Light. Their union generated the light. This was the central paradox of their relationship, that the union of the spatial dark and the temporal dark produced the spatial light and the temporal light. Ether, the bright upper air, the divine atmosphere, the luminous medium in which the celestial fires moved, was their firstborn. The brightness came from the darkness. The luminous came from the obscure. Hemera, day, the temporal condition of the illuminated world, was their second child. The time of the revealed came from the parents, who were the time of the hidden and the place of the hidden. The physics of the early universe expressed this same truth in its own vocabulary. The universe was dark before the first stars. The first stars formed in the dark, in the clouds of primordial hydrogen that collapsed under gravity in the dark between. The fire of the first stars was kindled in the dark, by the dark's own condensation, from the dark's own substance. The light came from the dark, not despite the dark, from the dark. The dark was the necessary prior condition of the light. Without the dark, no condensation. Without the condensation, no stars. Without the stars, no light. He and Nyx together were the condition from which ether and Hemera emerged. The between dark and the temporal dark together were the condition from which the between light and the temporal light came. This generative function was the most important thing about their union. They were not simply the dark. They were the dark that produced the light. They were the parents of the organized world's most fundamental quality. The brightness that made the organized world it was. He was the father of the light. The primordial between dark was the parent of the brightness. He did not remain only the dark. He was the dark that had produced the light, that was the condition of the world, the light illuminated. Chapter 20. Night and the between dark in the world. They were present in the world together as well as in their separate aspects. The night was the time when the spatial dark of the between and the temporal dark of the night were simultaneously operative. When his permanent dark and her cyclical dark were both in the world. The full dark of the midnight hours was the fullest expression of the complete dark, the darkness of the between, always present in the deep places, combined with the darkness of the temporal, present in the night's cycle. The midnight was when both aspects of the primordial dark were most completely expressed in the world above ground, when the surface world was in the conditions that were most thoroughly his and hers. The midnight had a specific quality in the human experience that expressed this fullness, the quality of the deepest dark, the most complete absence of the ordinary light, the condition in which the surface world was most thoroughly in the domain of the primordial dark. The mystic traditions knew this. The midnight was the hour of the deepest spiritual practice in many traditions, the hour of the deepest meditation, the deepest prayer, the deepest encounter with the sacred. Not because the midnight was intrinsically more sacred than the other hours, because the midnight was the hour when the conditions were most fully the conditions of the primordial dark, the conditions of the between, the conditions of the other knowing, the conditions in which the ordinary daylight consciousness was most thoroughly suspended. He and Nyx together were most fully present at the midnight, the hour when both the spatial and the temporal dark were at their most complete, was the hour of their joint presence, the hour of the full dark. The philosophical depth. Part 5. The between as concept. Chapter 21. The third position. The philosophical tradition inherited from the mythological tradition, the intuition of the between as a genuine third position. Not the first term, not the second term, but the condition within which both terms existed. Light and dark. The ordinary logic of the dichotomy made these opposites, the two poles of a spectrum, the maximum and minimum of brightness. The between on this view was simply the intermediate, the twilight that was between the full light and the full dark. But Erebus was not the intermediate. He was not the midpoint of the spectrum. He was the condition within which the spectrum existed, the medium within which both the full light and the full dark occurred. This was a different philosophical position. Not A or B or the midpoint between A and B. The condition within which A and B and the midpoint all existed. The medium that was prior to the spectrum. The Greek philosophical tradition worked toward this position in various ways. Plato's concept of the chora in the Timaeus, the receptacle, the space, the nurse of becoming, was reaching for the same third position. The chora was not the forms, the ideal, the eternal, the original. It was not the copies, the material, the temporal, the derived. It was the third thing, the receptacle within which the copies of the forms existed, the space within which the material world was organized. The chora was Erebus in Platonic vocabulary. The between that was neither the original nor the copy, neither the ideal nor the material, neither the light nor the dark. The condition within which all of these existed. He was the third position, the condition rather than the thing, the between rather than either of the poles that the between separated. Chapter 22. The Dark and the Rational. The Greek philosophical tradition associated light with the rational, with the organized, the comprehensible, the subject of logos. Plato's form of the good was likened to the sun, the source of the intelligible light that made the forms knowable. The rationale was the luminous, the comprehensible was the illuminated. The truth was what the light of reason revealed. The dark was associated with the irrational, with the chaotic, the incomprehensible, the resistant to logos. The darkness was the place where the logos did not reach, where the organized could not penetrate, where the rational illumination was absent. But this association, dark with irrational, light with rational, was more complex than the simple opposition suggested. The between dark was not the irrational in the sense of the merely chaotic, the merely resistant. The between dark was the condition of the rational, the medium within which the logos operated, the space within which the rational illumination made its distinctions. Without the dark background, the rational light could not illuminate anything, could not make distinctions, because distinctions required contrast, and contrast required the dark ground against which the illuminated was visible. He was the condition of the rational, not its opposite. The dark between was the condition of the logos's operation, the medium within which the rational light made its distinctions. Without the between dark, no distinctions. Without the distinctions, no logos. Without the logos, no rational organization of the world. The rational depended on the dark, the logos depended on the between. The light of reason required the dark of the between to illuminate anything. Chapter 23. The Between and Truth. The Presocratics placed the truth in unusual locations, not the obvious locations, not the locations where the ordinary person looked for the truth, not the surface of the visible world that the ordinary perception attended to. Heraclitus said the truth was in the underlying logos, the rational principle that was present everywhere, and that most people did not see, because they were attending to the surface rather than the depth. The truth was in the depth, not the surface. The depth was the dark. Parmenides placed the truth in the Eternal One, the unchanging, the undivided, the being that was not the becoming. The becoming was the surface, the change, the appearance. The truth was beneath the appearance. The truth was in the depth. Empedocles placed the truth in the forces, in love and strife, in the principles that moved the elements into their combinations and separations. The truth was in the movement, the process, the underlying force that produced the surface phenomena. In each case, the truth was in the depth, and the depth was the dark. The depth was the place where the ordinary light of ordinary perception did not reach, the place where the other knowing was required, the place that was his. He was the location of the depth truth. The dark between was the medium within which the depth truth existed, the space of the underlying logos, the space of the Eternal One, the space of the moving forces. The truth that was deeper than the surface was the truth that was in the between dark. This was not the claim that truth was irrational or unknowable. It was the claim that the knowing required for the depth truth was a different knowing from the ordinary surface. Knowing was the knowing of the depth, the knowing that operated in the conditions of the between, the knowing that was appropriate to the dark. Chapter 24. The Platonic Cave. Revisited. Plato's cave was his image, the prisoners in the cave who saw only the shadows, who took the shadows for the real, who had never seen the sun, were prisoners of the ordinary dark. Not Erebus's dark, not the primordial between dark, not the dark that was the condition of the deep truth. The ordinary dark of the cave, that was the darkness of ignorance, the darkness of the limited perspective. The philosopher's journey was the journey from the cave's darkness toward the sun, from the ignorance darkness toward the illumination truth. But the philosopher's journey required the dark. The philosopher had to be in the dark before beginning the ascent. The cave was the beginning of the philosophical journey. The dark was the starting point, and the ascent to the sun passed through the transitional dark, the darkness that was between the cave's ignorance dark and the sun's truth light. This transitional dark, the darkness of the philosopher's ascent, the between of the ignorance and the truth, was his dark. The between through which the ascent moved was the between dark that was his condition. The philosopher crossed his zone. The journey from ignorance to truth passed through the between dark, the transitional darkness of the ascent, the darkness that was neither the ignorance of the cave nor the illumination of the sun, but the between of the transition, was in his domain. He was the condition of the philosophical ascent, not the destination. The destination was Plato's sun, the form of the good, the illuminated truth, not the starting point. The starting point was the cave's ignorance dark, the darkness of the ordinary unexamined life. But the between, the dark of the transition, the medium of the ascent. The philosopher was in Erebus's domain during the ascent. Chapter 25. Hesiod's Theogony as Cosmological Argument. Hesiod's Theogony was not merely a collection of myths, it was a cosmological argument, the most comprehensive attempt of the archaic Greek tradition to give an account of the world's origin and structure. The argument had a specific structure. It began with the undifferentiated chaos. and moved through the first differentiations, Gaia, Tartarus, Eros, Erebus, Nyx, toward the increasingly organized and specific. The divine generations were the record of the world's progressive organization. From the Primordials to the Titans to the Olympians, each generation more organized, more specific, more fully the organized world that the mythology described. Erebus's position in this argument was the position of the first dark differentiation. He was the first moment in which the world had darkness as a specific quality, the first specific something in the direction of the obscure. And then from him and Nyx came Ether and Hemera, the first light. The cosmological argument moved from the undifferentiated, chaos, through the first dark, Erebus and Nyx, to the first light, Ether and Hemera. The world went from the undifferentiated through the dark to the light. This was the cosmological argument, the path from the undifferentiated to the organized world, passed through the dark. The organized, illuminated world was not the original condition. It was the product of the prior dark. The light was the production of the dark. This argument was sophisticated in a way that the later tradition sometimes missed. The tradition that wanted to begin with the light, to make the light primary, to make the dark derivative. Hesiod's account began with the dark and derived the light from it. The dark was prior. The light was produced. He was the necessary position in this argument. Without the dark differentiation, without Erebus's emergence from chaos, the path from the undifferentiated to the organized world could not be traced. He was the necessary intermediate, the first dark that was the condition of the first light, that was the condition of the organized world. Erebus, in the mythological narrative. Part 6, The Events of the Divine Drama. Chapter 26, The Background of the Titanomachy. He was the background of the Titanomachy, the great war between the Titans and the Olympians that established the current divine order. Not a participant, not a figure in the conflict. The background, the dark condition within which the conflict occurred. The Titanomachy was fought in his zone. The great war that shook the cosmos, that threw mountains and boiled the sea and rattled even Tartarus, was fought in the world that was in his medium. The divine figures who fought were fighting in the dark between that was his substance. The battle was in his domain. He held the battle, not intervened in it, not directed it, not participated on either side. Held it in the sense of being the medium within which it occurred. The dark between that was the space of the conflict. The conflict shook him. The Titanomachy disturbed the primordial dark, disturbed the medium within which it was fought. The mountains thrown, the seas boiling, the earth shaking. These disturbances were disturbances of the medium, disturbances of his substance. The conflict moved through the dark between, but the dark between persisted through the disturbance. The primordial condition was not ended by the conflict. The between dark was not reorganized by the outcome of the Titanomachy. When the Titans were confined in Tartarus, and the Olympian order was established, the between dark was still the between dark. He was still the medium. The organized world was still in his medium. The Titanomachy reorganized what was in the medium. It did not reorganize the medium. He was unchanged by the conflict. The dark between persisted through the conflict, between the things that were in the dark between. Chapter 27. The Confinement of the Titans. The Titans were confined in Tartarus, in the absolute depth, the cosmic bottom, the final below. The confinement was Tartarus's function, not his. Tartarus held the confined. He was the zone through which they were escorted to the confinement. The defeated Titans passing through the underworld zones, passing through the first dark, through the threshold, through the crossing, moved through his domain. The transition of the defeated divine generation from the governing world to the confined depth moved through the between dark. He received them in the transitional sense, not held them in the confining sense. Tartarus held them. The absolute depth was their prison. But they passed through his zone on the way to the confinement. The transition from the governing world to the confined depth was a transition, was a crossing, and the crossing was in his domain. This gave him a specific relationship to the defeat of the old order and the establishment of the new. He witnessed the transition, was the medium through which the transition moved. The defeated divine generation passed through the between dark that was his zone on their way to the absolute depth that was Tartarus. He witnessed the Titanomachy's conclusion, not as a participant, not as a judge, not as a governing figure, as the medium, as the between through which the transition from the old order to the new moved. The transition from the Titan Age to the Olympian Age passed through his zone. Chapter 28. Hermes and the Souls. Hermes was the psychopomp, the guide of souls, the being who conducted the dead from the living world to the underworld. He moved between the worlds. He crossed the threshold that was Erebus's zone. Hermes's function brought him regularly into the between dark. Every soul he guided from the living world to the underworld was a crossing through the transitional zone, through the first dark, through the threshold, through the between of the living and the dead. The relationship between Hermes and the between dark was the relationship between the active crossing agent and the passive medium of the crossing. Hermes moved through his medium. Hermes crossed his zone with every soul he guided. This made Hermes the being who most regularly inhabited the between dark in the active sense, who moved through it as a regular function, who crossed it back and forth, who was comfortable in the transitional zone in a way that most divine beings were not. Hermes was the between crosser. He was the between that was crossed. Their relationship was the relationship of the navigator and the medium, the one who moved through the dark between and the dark between through which the movement happened. The souls were conducted through him by Hermes. The transition from the living to the dead moved through his zone guided by the psychopomp. The between dark received the souls. Hermes guided them through the reception. Chapter 29. The Heroes Who Crossed. The mythology sent heroes to the underworld. Heracles descended to retrieve Cerberus. Orpheus descended to recover Eurydice. Odysseus went to consult the dead. Theseus attempted the impossible. Aeneas was conducted by the Sibyl. Each of these descents moved through Erebus's zone, each crossing from the living world to the organized underworld, passed through the threshold dark, through the first dark, through the between of the living and the dead. The heroes who crossed were the living crossing into the dark, the organized consciousness of the living, encountering the primordial dark of the between before encountering the organized underworld. The encounter with the between dark was an encounter with the condition, with the medium that was prior to the organized structure of the further underworld. Before the judgment, before the assignment to the appropriate region, before the organized world of the dead, the between dark. The crossing through the first dark before anything else. This had specific effects on the heroes who crossed. The encounter with the between dark was the encounter with the condition prior to the organized. The encounter with what the world was in its condition before the organized structure imposed its distinctions. The hero who crossed had to move through the condition before encountering the organized consequence. Orpheus's music moved through the between dark. His music, the music that was so extraordinary it could move the lords of the dead, moved through the threshold zone before it reached the organized underworld. The between dark received the music first, before Hades and Persephone heard it. The heroes carried the light of the living world into the between dark. The living who crossed brought their living quality, their warmth, their animation, their vitality, into the first dark. The between dark received them, the living in the dead zone, the warmth in the cold dark. He received the heroes. The between dark was the first encounter of the living hero with the underworld's reality. Chapter 30. The Unburied Dead. The most poignant population of the threshold zone was the unburied dead, the shades who had died without proper burial, who were condemned to wait at the edge of the crossing for 100 years before the ferry could take them. They were the inhabitants of the prolonged between. The threshold zone was designed for the transitional, for the brief crossing, the transit between the living world and the organized underworld. But the unburied dead were in the between for 100 years, were held in the transitional state, in the first dark, in the between, for the duration of their waiting. The 100 years was not an arbitrary duration. It was the mythology's expression of the appropriate proportion, the time that matched the gravity of the lack. The soul, without burial, lacked the community's acknowledgement. The community's failure to perform the funeral rites was the community's failure to acknowledge the transition from living to dead. The consequence was the extended between, the prolonged transitional state, the extended time in the threshold zone. He held them through the 100 years. The between dark held the waiting dead in the extended transitional state. The medium of the between was the medium in which the prolonged waiting occurred. The pathos of the unburied was the pathos of the prolonged between, not the final condition, not the permanent assignment to the organized underworld. The transitional state extended to the edge of the tolerable. The between stretched to accommodate the 100 years. He was the space of the patient waiting. The between dark was the medium of the patient extended transition. The Creative Dark, Part 7, Darkness and Making. Chapter 31, The Dark Before the Form. Every form began in the dark. Not metaphorically, literally. Before the sculptor's chisel touched the marble, the form was in the dark of the potential, in the uncarved stone that contained potentially every form that could be carved from it. Before the poet's word was written, the poem was in the dark of the unwritten, in the condition of the not yet formed that contained, potentially, every poem that could be formed from the language. The dark was the condition of the potential. The form came from the dark, came from the dark that was prior to the form, the dark that held the potential of the form before the form was actualized. He was the condition of every form's genesis, not the creator, not the one who decided what form would emerge or who executed the emergence. The condition, the dark prior to the form, though was the medium from which the form came. This was the generative quality of the primordial dark, expressed in the creative process. The between dark was generative not in the sense of actively producing, in the sense of being the condition within which the production was possible, the medium from which the form could come. The artist who faced the blank canvas was facing his condition, the dark potential of the not yet formed, the before of the form. The blank was not empty. The blank was full of the dark potential, full of every possible painting, not yet committed to the specific painting that would emerge. He was the condition of the creative potential. Every blank canvas, every uncarved stone, every unwritten page was in his domain, was the between dark of the creative process, the dark prior to the form, that was the condition of the form's genesis. Chapter 32, The Between of the Creative Act. The creative act itself was a crossing, a movement from the potential to the actual, from the dark prior to the form itself, and the crossing moved through the between. The between of the creative act was the moment of the transition, the moment when the potential was becoming the actual, when the dark of the not yet formed was giving way to the form, when the crossing from the before to the after was in process. This between was the most charged moment of the creative process, not the beginning. The beginning was the dark of the potential, the before, not the end. The end was the form, the after, the actualized. The between was the crossing, the moment of the form's emergence from the dark, the moment when the potential was becoming actual. The creative crossing moved through his zone, the transition from the potential to the actual, from the dark of the before to the form of the after, was a crossing through the between dark. Artists knew this. The moment of the transition in the creative process had a specific quality, the quality of the between, the quality of the crossing, the quality of the not yet finished, but no longer formless. The form was emerging. The dark was giving way to the form. The crossing was in process. He was the condition of the creative crossing. The between dark was the medium through which the form emerged, the dark from which the form came, the between through which the potential became actual. Chapter 33, The Darkness of the Original. Every original was in the dark before it was revealed. The original, the novel, the unprecedented, the genuinely new, was not derivable from what was already in the light. It came from the dark, from the between that was prior to the organized, from the condition that was before the specific form, from the dark medium that was the condition of the new form's emergence. This was the relationship between the dark and originality. The original came from the between dark, because the between dark was the condition from which the new could emerge. The already illuminated was the already organized, was the specific form that had already emerged from the dark, the already committed, the already actualized. The dark was the unorganized, the condition that had not yet committed to the specific form, the medium that could give rise to the new. He was the source of the original. The primordial between dark was the condition from which the genuinely new emerged. The dark medium that was prior to the organized, the condition from which the new form could come, that could not come from the already organized. The artist who was creating something genuinely new was working in his domain, was in the between dark of the not yet organized, was crossing the threshold from the dark of the potential to the form of the actual. The new was in the dark before it was in the light. This was the mythology's deepest claim about the dark and creativity. The darkness was not the enemy of the creative, but the source. The dark was the condition of the original. The between dark was the medium from which the genuinely new emerged. Chapter 34. The Dark and Philosophical Inquiry. The philosophical inquiry was a crossing into the dark, not into the dark of ignorance. Plato was clear that the cave was not the philosopher's destination. But the philosophical inquiry, in moving beyond the ordinary understanding, in questioning what was taken for granted, in refusing to accept the surface, was moving into the between dark that was prior to the ordinary, organized understanding. The philosopher who questioned what everyone assumed was moving into the between of the assumption and the truth, into the dark space that was between the assumed true and the actually true. The philosophical inquiry was a movement through the between dark. Socrates practiced this most visibly. The Socratic method, the questioning that revealed the ignorance beneath the assumed knowledge, the exposure of the not knowing that was behind the pretense of knowing, was a movement into the between dark. The assumed knowledge was the organized, the already illuminated, the form that was in the light. Socrates moved into the space between the assumption and the truth, into the between dark that was the condition of the genuine inquiry. He was the condition of the genuine philosophical inquiry. Not the destination, not the truth that the inquiry sought. The condition, the between dark through which the inquiry moved in its crossing from the assumed to the actual truth. The philosopher was in his domain during the inquiry. The between dark was the medium of the philosophical crossing, the dark through which the movement from the assumption to the truth moved. Part 8. The Permanent Between. Chapter 35. What he was in the organized world. The organized world, the world that the Olympians governed, the world of the divine drama and the mortal civilization and the stories that the mythology told, was entirely in his medium. The organized world was in the between dark. This was not a statement about the organized world's inferiority or its derivativeness. The organized world was real. The Olympians were real. The stories were real. But they were real in the medium, in the between dark that was the condition of their reality. The gods moved through his medium when they moved through the world. Zeus's thunderbolt traveled through the dark between the clouds and the earth. Hermes crossed his zone with every soul he conducted. The divine interventions in mortal affairs moved through the dark between the divine and the mortal. He was the condition of the divine-mortal interaction. The dark between the divine and the mortal, the medium through which the divine communicated with the mortal, through which the divine intervention reached the mortal world, was his medium. The between of the divine and the mortal was his. Every oracle was a crossing of his between, the divine communication to the mortal world, the communication that moved through the dark of the threshold, through the between of the divine and the mortal, moved through his medium. The oracle was a crossing of the between dark. He was the condition of the divine communication. The between dark was the medium through which the divine reached the mortal, the dark condition that made the crossing possible. Chapter 36. The between in every experience. Every experience was in the between. The experience, the meeting of the subject and the object, the encounter of the perceiver and the perceived, was itself a crossing of the between, a transit through the space that separated the experiencer from what was experienced. The between of experience was his. The space between the self and the world, the gap that had to be crossed for the self to experience the world, was the between dark that was his condition. The visual experience was the transit of light through the space between the object and the eye. The light traveled through the medium, through the air, through the dark between, from the illuminated object to the perceiving eye. The experience required the medium. The experience was in the medium. He was the condition of the experience's medium. The dark between, the space through which the light traveled from the object to the eye, was his. The experience moved through his domain. The auditory experience was the transit of sound through the medium between the source and the ear. The sound waves moved through the medium, through the air, through the dark between, from the sounding source to the hearing ear. The hearing was in the medium. Every form of experience was a transit through the between dark. Every perception moved through the medium that was his substance. Every encounter with the world moved through the space between the self and the world that was his space. He was the condition of every experience. Chapter 37. The between of relationship. The relationship was in the between. Every relationship, between persons, between beings, between the divine and the mortal, was in the between space that was his. The relationship was not in the persons, was not in either of the two persons who were in the relationship. The relationship was the between, the quality of the relation, the specific character of the connection, the particular form that the interaction between two persons took. This was in the between space, in the space between them, that was the condition of their relation. Love was in the between, not in the lover or the beloved. The love was the between quality, the relational quality, the character of the space between the two, that was the love. Friendship was in the between. The friendship was not in either friend, but between them. In the between space, that was the condition of their friendship. Conflict was in the between. The conflict was not in either combatant, but between them. In the between space, that was the condition of the conflict. Every relationship, every form of relation between separate beings, was in the between space that was his. He was the condition of every relationship, not the content, not what the relationship was about, but the space within which the relationship was. This was the most intimate of all his functions, the condition of every relationship. The primordial between dark was the condition of every connection between separate beings, the space within which every relationship occurred, the medium that was the condition of the relation. He was the condition of love and friendship and conflict and every form of human and divine relation. The between that was his, was the between in which all relations were. Chapter 38. The Permanent Medium. He was the permanent medium. This was the most fundamental fact about him, and it needed to be stated simply and directly. He was the permanent medium, the constant condition, the always present between. Not permanent in the sense of the unchanging substance. The medium was not the same as the fixed, the frozen, the eternal in the Platonic sense of the unchanging ideal. The medium was constant in the sense of being always present, always there as the between, always the condition, always the space in which the things existed. The things changed. The organized world changed. The Titans gave way to the Olympians. The mythological ages succeeded each other. The specific arrangements of the divine world changed with the succession of divine generations. But the medium did not change. The between dark was always the between dark. The condition was always the condition. He was unchanged through all the changes of the organized world. The Titanomachy changed who governed the organized world. He was unchanged. The Gigantomachy challenged the organized order. He was unchanged. The heroic age came and went. He was unchanged. He was the constant beneath the change, the permanent medium within which the changing organized world existed. The between dark that was always the between dark, regardless of what the things in the between dark were doing. This permanence was not the permanence of the dominant, not the permanence of the regime that maintained itself through power and organization. The permanence of the condition, the permanence that was not maintained by anything, because it did not need maintenance. The medium was permanent, because the condition was the condition regardless of whether it was maintained. He was permanent, because the between was between regardless. The deep philosophical implications. Part 9. The between as fundamental reality. Chapter 39. The priority of the relation. Modern philosophy has sometimes argued for the priority of the relation over the relata, the claim that the relation is more fundamental than the things related, that the between is more primary than the things between which the between is. This was not the ordinary intuition. The ordinary intuition was that the things were primary, and the relations were secondary, that the persons were prior to the friendship, that the atoms were prior to the chemical bond, that the stars were prior to the gravitational relationship. But the argument for the priority of the relation was serious. If the things were constituted by their relations, if what a thing was given by the relations it stood in, then the relations were as fundamental as the things, or more fundamental. The electron was what it was because of its relation to the electromagnetic field. The electromagnetic field was what it was because of the electrons and other charges in it. The thing and the relation were mutually constituting. Neither was prior, or the relation was prior because the thing was constituted by the relation. He was the medium of the relation, the between dark in which the things stood in relation to each other. If the relation was prior to the things, then the between dark was prior to the things, was the condition from which the things derived their specific natures by being in the relation. The priority of the relation was the priority of the between dark. The philosophical argument that the relation was more fundamental than the relator was the philosophical argument that was the between dark as condition of the things. He was, on this view, more fundamental than the things he separated. The between dark was the condition from which the things derived their specificity, and was therefore prior to the things in the relevant philosophical sense. Chapter 40. The Between and the Void. The modern physics of the quantum vacuum was the most explicit scientific expression of the between's reality. The quantum vacuum was not the empty space, was not the nothing that the naive understanding associated with the absence of ordinary matter. The quantum vacuum was the ground state of the quantum fields, the state of minimum energy, the condition that was most thoroughly cleared of the temporary excitations that constituted the ordinary matter. But the ground state was not empty. The quantum fields were present in the ground state, were present everywhere, at every point of space, with the minimum energy that was their ground state energy. The ground state was the fields in their least excited form, but the fields were still there, and the ground state had energy. The 0-point energy of the quantum vacuum was real energy, was the energy of the fields at their minimum, the energy of the between when no ordinary matter was present. The vacuum had energy. The between had substance. The space between things was occupied by the fields in their minimum state, was not empty, was not nothing, was the real constituent of the space that the naive understanding called empty. He was the mythological expression of this reality, the mythological claim that the between was not empty, that the dark between was a real constituent of the world, that the space between things was filled with his substance. The quantum vacuum confirmed what the mythology had claimed. The between was not nothing. The between had substance. The dark between was real. Chapter 41. The Between and Time. The between had a temporal dimension, as well as a spatial dimension. Not only the between of space, the space between things, but the between of time, the between of the before and after, the space between the was and the will be. The present moment was the between, not the past, not the already organized, the already determined, the fixed, not the future, not the not yet, the possible, the open. The present moment was the between, the crossing point, the transitional, the moment in which the past was becoming the future. He was the condition of the present moment. The between dark was the condition of the now, the medium of the present that was between the past and the future. This was the most intimate of all his presences, in the present moment, in the now. Every experience of the present was in the between dark that was his. The present moment was the temporal between, the crossing from the past to the future, the transitional now, the between. The now was always his. Every present moment was in his domain. The temporal between that was the now, was the temporal expression of the spatial. Between that was his substance. He was the condition of the present. The between dark was the condition of the now. Every moment of every experience was in his medium. Chapter 42. The Between and Consciousness. The consciousness was in the between, not the contents of consciousness, not the specific thoughts and perceptions and memories that constituted the content. The consciousness itself, the condition of awareness, the space within which the thoughts and perceptions occurred. The consciousness was the between of the world and the self, the space that was between the objective world and the subjective experience of the world, was the consciousness. The consciousness was not the world and was not the self, was the between of the two, the space within which the world was experienced by the self. He was the condition of the consciousness. The between dark was the condition of the between of the world and the self, was the condition of the space within which the experience occurred. This was the deepest of all his functions, the condition of the consciousness. The primordial between dark was the condition of the very space of awareness, the medium within which the world was experienced. The between, that was the consciousness itself. Every experience of consciousness, every moment of awareness, every thought, every perception, was in his domain. The consciousness was the between, and the between was his. He was the condition of awareness. The primordial between dark was the condition of the very possibility of experience, the medium within which the world was known. The between, that was the knowing, the present and the eternal. Part 10. What he is. Chapter 43. The between that is here. He is here. This is the most direct thing that can be said about the permanent between. It is here. It is the between that is always here, the space between the things that is always present, the condition that is always the condition. The between of these words is his, the space between the letters on this page, or the space between the pixels on this screen, in the mode in which most things are now read, is the between dark. The visible words are in the dark between. The readable text is against the dark background. Without his between, the text would be unreadable. Without the space between the letters would merge. Without the dark background, the words would have no contrast against which they were visible. He is the condition of the text's readability. He is also in the between of the words and their meanings, in the space between the written sign and the understood sense. The meaning of the word is not the word itself. The meaning is in the between, in the space between the sign and what the sign signifies. The meaning is the between crossing, the transit from the sign to the signified, the movement through the dark between the literal and the understood. He is in the meaning. The primordial between dark is the condition of the meaning, the medium of the transit from the sign to the signified, the between through which the understanding moves. Every act of understanding moves through his between. Every moment of comprehension crosses the dark between of the sign and the signified. He is the condition of understanding. Chapter 44. The between of reading and writing. The reader and the writer were in the between space between the one who wrote and the one who reads, in the between of the past of the writing and the present of the reading, in the between of the two minds that the text connected. He was the condition of the literary encounter, the space between the writer and the reader, the space that the text crossed, the between that the words spanned, was the between dark that was his. The literary encounter was in his domain. Every book was a crossing of his between. Every text moved through the dark between of the writer's past and the reader's present, the writer's intention and the reader's reception, the written and the understood. The text crossed the between dark to connect the writer and the reader. He was the condition of the literary tradition, the tradition of texts, the tradition that carried wisdom and story and knowledge from the past to the present, from the writer to the reader, moved through his between. The dark between of the written and the read was the medium of the tradition. Hesiod wrote in his medium. The text of the Theogony crossed the dark between of Hesiod's archaic Greece and every subsequent reading. The crossing was the transit through the between dark, through the dark that was the medium of the text's transmission. He is the condition of this text, the between that this text crosses, the between the writing and the reading, the past and the present, the writer and the reader, is his. He is the medium of the transmission. Chapter 45. The dark between the stars. He is in the space between the stars, the between dark of the cosmos, the interstellar medium, the intergalactic medium, the space that fills the universe between the luminous matter of the stars and galaxies, is the physical expression of what he was, the mythological expression of. The interstellar medium was not empty. It was filled with the gas and dust and radiation that constituted the actual material of the galaxy beyond the stars. The space between the stars was occupied, was the medium of the galaxy, was the substance between the organized matter of the stellar population. The intergalactic medium was even more vast, was the material that filled the space between the galaxies, the medium of the universe at the largest scales. The space between the galaxies was filled with the plasma that was the universe's most widespread material. And beyond the visible matter, the dark matter, the dark energy, the constituents of the universe that did not interact with light, and that constituted the overwhelming majority of the universe's actual content. The between was mostly dark. The cosmos was mostly Hyses. He is in the space between the stars. The primordial between dark that was the condition of the world's structure, in the mythological account, was the dark matter, and the quantum vacuum, and the interstellar medium that was the condition of the universe's structure, in the physical account. Different vocabulary, same reality. The between is real. The between is filled. The between is his. Chapter 46. the Father of the light that illuminates all things. He was the Father of the light. Ether was his firstborn, the brightness that was the condition of the divine realm, the luminous medium within which the celestial fires moved. He is still the Father of the light. The light that illuminates everything is still the production of the dark that is its condition. The light moves through the dark between, moves through the medium that is his substance, crosses the between that is his domain, arrives at its destination by traversing the space that is high S. The light could not illuminate anything without the between, without the medium through which the light moved from the source to the illuminated. The light required the between to cross. The between that the light crossed was his. Every illuminated thing is illuminated through his between. Every seen thing is seen because the light moved through the dark, between from the light source to the eye. Every visual experience is the light crossing his between. He is the condition of the visible. The primordial between dark is the condition of the light's illuminating, the medium through which the light must move to illuminate. He is the Father of the light and the condition of the light's illuminating. The dark between is the condition of the brightness. The primordial darkness is the father of the organized world's most essential quality and the medium through which that quality operates. He is the dark between. He is the father of the light. He is the condition of the world. Epilogue. The dark between all things. This story was told in the between, not as a literary figure, not the between as metaphor, in the literal between. The between the letters, the between the words, the between the lines, the between the reading mind and the written page. Everything in this story was in the dark between. The words were in the dark between that separated them from each other and made them visible as the specific words they were. The meaning was in the dark between of the written and the understood. The transmission was in the dark between of the past of the writing and the present of the reading. He was the condition of this story being tellable. The primordial between dark was the condition of the words being distinct from each other, the condition of the meaning crossing from the written to the read, the condition of the story's transmission across the between of the past and the present. He was in every word. The dark between was in every space between the letters, in every space between the words, in every space between the ideas. He was in the silence between the sentences, the pause between the spoken words, the silence that made the words distinct from each other, the dark between that made the speech intelligible as speech, was his. He was in the white space on the page. The visible page was white paper with dark marks. The marks were the text. The white space between the marks was his, was the between dark that made the marks visible as the specific marks they were. He was everywhere in this story that was about him. The story of the between dark was told in the between dark. The story of the primordial medium was told in the medium. This is appropriate. He cannot be separated from what is told about him, cannot be removed from the telling, cannot be the external subject of a story that was not in his domain. Every story is in his domain. Every telling is in the between dark. Every text crosses his between. He is Erebus. He is the dark between. He is the condition of the world, and the condition of the story, and the condition of the telling, and the condition of the reading. He is the between in which this story exists. He is the between. He is between all things. He is still between all things. He will always be between all things. The between is real. The dark between is real. He is real. The space between these words is real. He is here. Here ends the story of Erebus. Or rather, here ends the telling, because Erebus himself does not end, does not conclude, does not arrive at the completion that the ending of a story requires. He is the between, and the between does not end because the between is the condition of there being anything between which there can be a between. He is the dark between the stars. He is the dark between the words. He is the dark between the living and the dead. He is the dark between the light and the light. He is the threshold. He is the crossing. He is the medium. He is the condition. He is Erebus. He is between everything and every other thing. He is here in the between of these words and their meaning. He is real. The between is real. Look into the space between things. That is Erebus. He has always been there. He will always be there. He is the between.